Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in here as we look at Unit 3 in our online poetry course, which is, the title of Unit 3 then is The Poetic Mind. And like I suggested in my earlier announcement, we can see connections between Units 2 and 3 in terms of beginning to think about how we think as poets. So Unit 3 kind of extends that and has us looking at this really interesting kind of collision of, collision of two very different, on the surface at least, expressions of what ends up being a very similar idea about how the poetic or the creative mind can work. And so you might feel like this resonates with how you already kind of process experience and those sort of pieces that go to make up the art that we produce, whether it's painting or music or, for us, poetry. You might find that the expression of the idea here is very different than what you kind of imagined your way of working is, which is totally fine. Or you might kind of find that it's different, but end up sort of thinking that this is a useful way of imagining how the poetic mind can operate to produce fairly interesting poems on the other end of it. So the short story here is that we're not studying this because it's the model we have to follow. It just happens to be a really interesting expression of one way in which the poetic mind is imagined to work. So the interesting kind of part of this isn't just the idea itself, but where it shows up. So we first will read it in an essay that was written by T.S. Eliot, more famous as a poet, but also, at least in his own time, famous as a critic as well. And he played this great role of being a critic and being able to sort of formulate ideas and ideals about what poets should be and what poems should be. And of course he was a poet himself, and so it's like he sort of got to make the rules about what a good poem is and then judge his own poems by them. So you kind of always come out a winner if you can rig it up like that. But anyway, we're reading an essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And the focus of the essay is really more about, just like the title says, what is the relationship between the individual poet, the individual talent, and the poetic tradition that comes before that person. So it's really a question of how one fits into the long literary tradition that one is part of. But along the way, Eliot makes some interesting comments about, again, how the poetic mind can operate, and he posits through this analogy that the poetic mind kind of works by collecting fragments. He was a really interesting user of fragments within his own work, but also sort of a theorist of fragments as well. And you'll see this play out in terms of the theory he posits here, how we end up being kind of like receptacles for all of these various fragments or pieces that don't make sense individually until this one item, the catalyst, is introduced into the situation. Whatever that might be, it might be just some kind of random experience you have, it might be something you see out of the corner of your eye, some weird story you read in the newspaper, whatever, but it's that one thing that kind of brings the other fragments together in this meaningful way. And I provided the entirety of the essay here in this really cool Google ebook reader kind of thing, which is pretty cool to have embedded there, so you've got it all right there that you can read. But I've directed your attention to where he makes really the most obvious expression of like how the poet's mind kind of works here. So I encourage you to read the whole thing, but it is a fairly ponderous style that we're not really used to anymore, I don't think. So really you're looking for where Eliot gets into expressions of how the artist's mind or how the poet's mind really works. The next thing that we have then is, and I kind of jumped up from my seat when I saw this just on TV the first time, an advertisement from what was a whole series of ads, like a whole campaign for HP, Hewlett-Packard, that features Gwen Stefani from No Doubt and her own solo career. So this sort of famous, artist figure. And she expresses, or of course it's written for her to express, this idea that is presented in a much more contemporary way, and it's sort of a cool visual thing going on, but fundamentally it's almost exactly the same idea about how the artistic mind works as what Eliot had expressed almost a century earlier. So again, it was this really, I think the idea itself is interesting, but then its expression in these two very different forms really caught my attention. And so I think it's sort of interesting to see just for that purpose. Okay, so then we have a discussion board to look at with a bunch of questions about, Eliot's ideas and, again, how they're re-expressed in the HP advertising. I'm also having you read The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, probably Eliot's most famous poem, most famous read poem. His most famous is maybe The Wasteland, but very few people actually wade through that one. So we'll call Prufrock the most famous and actually the one that's read of his. Again, I provided it in a little e-reader here, and it just happens to be a version, or the version, of its first printing in Poetry, the magazine, that was published out of Chicago. So it's sort of a cool local connection, even though Eliot himself was more or less a Boston guy until he became a British citizen and spent most of his life in London. In fact, Eliot really rigged that up well too, because then you get, if you're born American and then become British, you get to show up in both the American Lit Anthology and the Brit Lit Anthology. So he was a pretty clever guy when it came to all of this stuff. I'm kidding. I'm sure he didn't really think about that, although you never know. So again, you can look at the love song here. What's useful about this printing is that it doesn't provide any footnotes or explanation. It's just the text as the text appears. So the first thing we get is this big Italian verse, and my Italian's pretty weak. I don't know about yours. There's no explanation about where it comes from. So one of the things that I'm asking you to think about, given Eliot's argument that poetry, modern poetry, should be elusive, like it shouldn't be immediately apprehendable, and allusive, it should allude to things outside of itself, which again kind of ties into this idea of the individual's relationship to tradition, is one of allusion, so there should be use of tradition in poetry. Again, Eliot's argument, not one that we need to follow or agree with necessarily. But this printing, or this version of the love song, is very different, I bet, than ones that you run into before, like in an anthology, that will always provide pretty copious footnotes to help guide us through the poem. So it's interesting to think about how a reader confronts a poem like Prufrock, which is, again, on many levels pretty accessible as far as poetry goes, without any of the helping aids that something like the modern anthology provides in terms of footnotes. So we can really begin to get a sense of how Eliot might have imagined his readers experiencing his poem. I'm sure he didn't imagine a whole bunch of footnotes to accompany a poem that were added, as an afterthought by a team of editors. Okay, so sort of a bunch of things that we're coordinating for this this unit, and then I guess in terms of units 2 and 3 and how we're sort of bringing them together, we had looked in unit 2 at a talk by Ted Kooser where he reads a bunch of his poems. Some of his work is in our textbook. He, again, is a fairly famous contemporary poet, and as I mentioned, he's the champion of the accessible. So in a lot of ways, Ted Kooser and T.S. Eliot present really different approaches to, or different mindsets in terms of, what is a poem supposed to do and how does it interact with the reader. So Unit 1 was introductions. 2 and 3 kind of coordinate some interesting ideas about how poetry works. And then finally in Unit 4, we'll get to the actual writing of the poem, but hopefully in terms of our lead-in here, we've actually had some time not just to plunk ourselves down and begin writing, but to really think about what it means to be a poet, how the poetic mind works, and to give ourselves some scaffolding, I guess if you want to call it that, so that we can really begin to think about making poems effective in terms of their doing something to or for or with a reader. Again, not just that therapeutic kind of work where we need to get something out and then it's done, but the kind of writing that we're doing for this class where we're thinking of ourselves as poets, we're conscious of how the poetic mind works, we're thinking about being intentional with all our choices. So I did it this way because, I did it this way because I want this effect, I want the reader to be surprised here, therefore I did this, all of that kind of stuff. So if you're wondering about where the actual writing of poetry in poetry writing class is, it's just around the corner with our first workshop. Okay, so I think I'll leave it at that. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to be in touch with me, and be sure you're reading all the directions so that you're covering all the requirements for the discussion board work that we're doing. All right, I'll talk to you soon.